There is a category of watch that operates in a space most brands spend decades trying to reach. Under a director's light on a film set, strapped to the wrist of an icon, doing what no marketing campaign has ever done, as cleanly or as permanently, making a specific reference number feel mythological. The watches that appeared in the right films at the right moments did not merely sell units. They created archetypes. They defined what a watch could mean culturally, commercially, and psychologically to a global audience that had never set foot in a watch boutique. The collector community has spent decades trying to separate the genuine horological merit of these pieces from the fictional gravity surrounding them, and that is a genuinely difficult line to draw. This is the complete dissection of the watches that made cinema history and the industry that followed in their wake. Sean Connery wore a Rolex Submariner reference 6538 on the wrist of James Bond in the 1962 film Dr. No, and that single placement launched what became the longest and most commercially impactful product placement relationship in the history of cinema. The reference 6538 is known among collectors as the Big Crown Submariner, named for its oversized 8mm winding crown, which predates the introduction of the triple-lock, trip-lock crown system. It ran a caliber 1030 movement, featured a 38mm case in oyster steel, had a glossy gilt chapter ring dial with Mercedes hands, no crown guards, and a depth rating marked at 200 meters. The dial typography on original 6538 examples is dense and layered, and the luminous plots on the hour markers are substantial, consistent with the military-derived specification that Rolex was chasing across this reference family. There are no hour markers at the 3, 6, and 9 positions. The bezel insert on the 6538 was aluminum, a simple click bezel construction without the refinements that later generations would introduce. It is a profoundly utilitarian object dressed up in Connery's cinematic authority. What happened when that watch appeared on screen in Dr. No was not accidental, but neither was it the outcome of a sophisticated brand strategy. The production had access to several options, and the decision to use a Submariner was partly functional and partly aesthetic. The sub read well on camera, communicated utility and controlled precision, and it matched the character's profile. The effect on the collector market was not immediate, because the infrastructure for celebrity watch documentation did not exist in 1962 the way it does today. But as the Bond franchise accumulated cultural weight, as Connery's footprint became undeniable, and as serious collectors in the 1990s and 2000s began reconstructing the specific references used across each film, the 6538 became one of the most aggressively hunted vintage Rolex references in existence. Unpolished examples, with intact dials in verified original condition, now trade north of $150,000, with double-signed examples carrying retailer signatures alongside Rolex's own reaching considerably higher. The watch has been replicated, misrepresented, and faked at a rate that should give every prospective buyer cause for extended pause. It is a reference where independent authentication from a specialist is not optional. The film created the demand, and the demand created the fraud market. That is the complete arc of what cinema does to an object. The tag Heuer, Monaco reference 1133B, is a case study in how a watch can fail commercially, get rescued by a film, and then spend the next 5 decades being misunderstood by the same industry that profits from the myth. Heuer introduced the Monaco in 1969 alongside the Carrera, both powered by the caliber 11, which was among the first automatic chronograph movements ever produced, developed in collaboration with Breitling-Buren and Dubois-Dupraz. The Monaco's case was square, water-resistant, and featured a crown positioned on the left side of the case, which remains one of the only mechanical chronographs in production history to place the crown there. The dial was blue. The case was 39mm stainless steel. It was polarizing from launch, and initial retail performance was poor enough to raise genuine questions about the design's commercial viability. Then Steve McQueen wore the Monaco during the shooting of Le Mans in 1971, and the trajectory of the reference changed permanently. McQueen's relationship with motorsport was not performative. He raced competitively at a serious level, was denied entry into the actual 1970 Le Mans race by the insurance policy attached to his film production, and approached the Le Mans shoot with the kind of physical and technical commitment that his public persona had been built on. He wore the Monaco during driving sequences and in off-camera production photographs, and those images circulated through the automotive and watch press with an intensity that no paid campaign has ever manufactured convincingly. The watch looked correct on his wrist, the square case, the blue dial, the left crown. It worked in a way that a conventional round sport watch on that wrist would not have. Original 1133B references from the early 1970s are now extraordinarily valuable, with condition-matched examples reaching prices that have little to do with the technical specifications of the Caliber 11, which is a historically significant movement but not a monument of finishing or haute horlogerie complexity. You are paying for a cultural artifact. Tag Heuer, which acquired Heuer in 1985, has reissued the Monaco in various forms since, with the current lineup, including a chronograph powered by the Caliber Heuer 02. A genuinely capable column wheel automatic chronograph movement with an 80-hour power reserve and 28,800 beats per hour oscillation. The film created the watch's commercial identity. The watch now carries the film as permanent collateral. The Omega Seamaster, 300 meters appearance in GoldenEye in 1995, is the most commercially consequential single watch placement in the history of the industry, measured by the dollar value of brand equity generated per second of screen time. The deal between Omega and the Bond franchise transferred placement rights from Rolex, which had never paid for the placement but had accumulated enormous benefit from it across 3 decades, to Omega, which paid and recouped the investment at a scale that restructured its global market position. The specific reference used in GoldenEye was the 2541.80, a quartz-powered Seamaster 300 meters on a metal bracelet running the caliber 1538. That detail is worth sitting with. The watch Bond wore on screen in 1995. The placement that anchored Omega's prestige recovery was powered by a quartz movement. The mythology of Bond as a precision mechanical watch wearer was built on a battery. The Seamaster 300 meters had been introduced in 1993 as a genuine dive watch with a wave pattern dial, unidirectional rotating bezel with a 60-minute graduation, helium escape valve, and a water resistance of 300 meters. The design photographed with strong visual clarity under cinematic lighting conditions, and when Pierce Brosnan wore it across GoldenEye and subsequent entries in the franchise, the effect on Omega's global sales was measurable and dramatic. Omega had been losing ground to Rolex in the luxury sports segment. The Bond Association restructured the brand's positioning in a way that years of traditional advertising had not. References evolved film by film as the partnership matured. The Quartz 254 1.80 gave way to mechanical configurations, and by the Daniel Craig era, Omega was placing the Planet Ocean and eventually the Seamaster, 300 meters reference 210.9 2.4, 2.20.01.001 in titanium, running the coaxial master chronometer caliber 8806, which carries META certification for magnetic resistance up to 15,000 Gauss. The distance between the 1995 quartz and that movement represents the full arc of what sustained cinematic presence can fund in research, development, and institutional credibility. The Hamilton Ventura is one of the rare watches in horological history where the design itself is so unconventional that it required two separate cinematic moments, separated by nearly 40 years, to fully anchor it in popular culture. Hamilton introduced the Ventura in 1957, powered by the Hamilton 500 caliber, which was the world's first commercial electric watch movement. The case was triangular, asymmetric, and unlike anything the Swiss or American industry had produced to that point. Elvis Presley wore one on his wrist in the 1961 film Blue Hawaii, which gave the watch a first cultural association. But the media infrastructure of the early 1960s did not allow that placement to propagate globally with modern equivalent reach. The second moment arrived in 1997 when Barry Sonnenfeld dressed Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in the Ventura as part of the Men in Black agency uniform. The watch's alien geometry suddenly made narrative sense within the film's visual logic. The Men in Black existed outside recognizable cultural reference points, and their watches should communicate the same institutional displacement. The Ventura read simultaneously as futuristic and antique, which is exactly the quality a production designer wants from a timepiece meant to establish that the wearer operates outside ordinary time frames. The Hamilton 500 caliber itself was a meaningful piece of engineering history. It ran on a 1.5-volt battery at 360 beats per hour and produced accuracy competitive with fine mechanical movements of the same era. Original 1957 production examples in good condition are legitimate collector objects now, with values reflecting both movement significance and accumulated cultural weight. Hamilton, under Swatch Group ownership, continues producing the Ventura in modern quartz and automatic configurations, but the fundamental case shape has not changed since 1957 because the design contains no logic that revision would improve. Martin Sheen's wrist in Apocalypse Now carries a Seiko reference, 6105-8110, and it is the rare example of a watch achieving mythological status through a film that nobody involved with would want to describe as a controlled production environment. Coppola's Philippine shoot overran catastrophically. The budget collapsed. Sheen suffered a heart attack during filming, and the final cut was assembled from a chaos that the documentary Hearts of Darkness later documented in clinical detail. The 6105-8110 on Sheen's wrist was not a prop department decision. It was the watch he was already wearing, and the production left it there because nobody with authority over such details was in a condition to raise objections. The 6105-8110 was introduced by Seiko in 1970 as a serious dive watch rated to 150 meters, later revised to 200 meters. The cushion case used a shape derived from JIS standard design principles. The crystal was hardlex, and the movement was the caliber 6105A and subsequently 6105B, an automatic with Diashock protection and a hacking seconds function. The watch retailed in the early 1970s for approximately $75. It was issued to military personnel, purchased at PX stores, and worn in environments where a Rolex would represent an absurdity of context. That background is exactly what made it narratively correct for the film and exactly what makes its current secondary market position genuinely strange. Original unrestored 6105-8110 examples in good condition, with intact dials and functioning movements now trade between $1,500 and $4,000 depending on configuration, representing a price appreciation almost entirely attributable to the film's cultural half-life. Seiko has never officially reissued the 6105-8110, though elements of its design philosophy appear across the modern Prospex lineup. The watch is a data point in the argument that authenticity captured by cinema accidentally creates a value that no intentional placement agreement can replicate or sustain at equivalent intensity. The IWC Mark 11 was developed in 1948 under contract for the British Royal Air Force, and the specification document that governed its design was unambiguous. The movement had to achieve accuracy within plus or minus 6 seconds per day across multiple positions. The case had to meet meaningful anti-magnetic standards. The dial had to remain legible under cockpit conditions and under stress. The result was a 36mm stainless steel case housing the IWC caliber 89, an automatic movement with the Peloton winding mechanism, and a soft iron inner case providing anti-magnetic protection. The RAF designation was 6B/346. It is a watch that was designed entirely around function with no accommodation for ornament, which is precisely the quality that makes it visually compelling 5 decades after production ended. Anthony Minghella's The English Patient, released in 1996, used the Mark 11 as a recurring visual element associated with Ralph Fiennes' portrayal of the Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almásy. The prop decision was historically grounded in a way that most prestige film prop choices are not. Almásy is a pre-war aviator and North African cartographer operating in a world where the Mark 11 exists as a logical object. The watch did not require any narrative justification because the character's profile justified it entirely. The effect on IWC's collector reputation was more diffuse than the Bond-type sales spike. The film's audience skewed toward a demographic that did not immediately translate to watch purchase volume. But the Mark 11 became associated with a particular mode of serious, intellectually grounded romanticism that aligned with how IWC wanted its pilot's watch line, positioned against the Rolex Explorer and similar alternatives. Original RAF-issued examples, identifiable by the 6B/346 caseback engraving and broad arrow military marking, now trade at premiums over civilian equivalents that the technical specifications alone would not generate. The Casio F91W occupies a position in cinema history that is genuinely difficult to categorize alongside the references that surround it. And that difficulty is itself the point. The F91W was introduced in 1991 at approximately $10 and has remained in continuous production since with essentially no design revision. It is a 37mm resin-cased digital module with a basic chronograph, an alarm, an electroluminescent backlight, and a quoted accuracy of plus or minus 30 seconds per month. The build quality is exactly what $10 buys. The watch achieved a grim cultural resonance when it became documented that improvised explosive device construction instructions circulating in certain operational environments referenced the F91W as a timing component. United States military detention facilities during the early 2000s noted it as an indicator of potential interest in detainees. Catherine Bigelow's The Hurt Locker and Zero Dark 30 subsequently used the watch in their visual grammar of counterterrorism environments and operational austerity. Cheap, available in any market on Earth, anonymous, and functionally adequate. The collector community's relationship with the F91W is irreverent and knowing. It sells by the million annually and is worn across every socioeconomic bracket as a deliberate anti-status statement. Its appearance in serious military cinema gave it a layer of meaning that its specifications do not earn, and that gap between meaning and specification is the watch's actual cultural content. Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight placed a Patek Philippe reference 5711 on Christian Bale's wrist during several key scenes, and the production decision reveals how the most carefully considered cinematic watch choices function as character construction rather than product placement. The 5711, powered by the caliber 324 SC with its 3.3mm thin automatic movement and Gyromax balance wheel, was produced in stainless steel at an annual volume in the low four figures globally, with Patek Philippe maintaining wait lists and restricting supply in ways that made it harder to acquire than most gold complications in the catalog. Its discontinuation in 2021 sent secondary prices above $60,000 for a reference that had retailed at approximately 34,000 Swiss francs. Bruce Wayne in Nolan's trilogy is constructed as a man whose wealth is performative and whose identity is deliberately obscured. His tastes are calibrated to communicate a specific kind of power. Serious, understated by the standards of what he could theoretically spend, and accessible only to those with the institutional knowledge to recognize it. The 5711 in stainless steel is exactly that object. Nolan's production team specified the 5711 rather than defaulting to a Rolex Daytona or a Cartier Ballon Bleu, and that specificity reflects a level of research that most productions do not sustain across prop selection. The watch communicates something true about the character before any dialogue confirms it, and that efficiency of storytelling is what separates considered prop work from generic luxury signaling. Ryan Gosling's portrayal of Neil Armstrong in Damien Chazelle's First Man is structured around emotional suppression, and the Omega Speedmaster professional on his wrist during the lunar surface sequences carries more historical weight than any other prop choice in the film. The prop department sourced the reference 105.012, which is the specific Speedmaster generation worn during the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969, with accuracy. The 105.012 housed the caliber 321, a column wheel manual wind chronograph movement developed from Lemania origins, which Omega used in Speedmaster production until 1968, when the caliber 861 replaced it. The distinction between the 321 and the 861 is the central fault line in Speedmaster collecting, with 321-powered references commanding substantial premiums. The Speedmaster's NASA relationship began with formal government qualification testing in 1965. 4 chronographs were submitted: the Rolex reference 6238, the Longines 30L, the Hamilton 600, and the Omega Speedmaster. The Omega passed tests the others failed, including thermal shock cycling from -18 to +93 degrees Celsius, humidity exposure, and high-frequency vibration simulation. NASA qualification as flight certified for manned missions followed, and the Speedmaster has been on every crewed American space mission since, including the Apollo 13 abort, during which the crew used the Speedmaster to time the critical engine burn that returned them to Earth. That functional history is not mythology. It is documented operational record. What makes First Man's placement exceptional is how Chazelle deploys the watch within the narrative. It appears without exposition at moments of internal pressure in Gosling's performance, before the lunar module hatch opens, during the descent sequence, in the silence of the surface. The decision to trust the object's weight without explaining it is the filmmaking equivalent of wearing a watch without mentioning it. Omega reissued the caliber 321 in 2021 within a recreation of the Speedmaster reference 3861 at a retail price approaching $10,000, driven by collector demand that films like First Man have sustained and intensified across a global audience that understands exactly what the movement represents and why the 1968 transition away from it is a loss that no subsequent caliber has fully addressed.